In any other civilized country in the world, people would remember a militarily successful figure like Hans-Joachim Marseille. During his short time on Earth, he was not only the leading fighter pilot in the African war theater, but with his aerial victories, he also remained unbeaten at the top. Now, in Germany, not only has every economic principle been turned upside down for quite some time, but after the successful march of the uneducated through the institutions, even physics has been as well. Because, for example, when a balloon bursts loudly, the farther away you are, the more the bang continuously decreases in intensity, until it fades away into infinity and becomes a mere memory. That's just how it is, but not so in Germany. Because ever since the last shot was fired on the last day of World War II, the sound of that shot, against all physical laws and logically inexplicably, becomes not quieter and quieter, but on the contrary, louder and louder every day, accompanied by ever more bizarre interpretations from an industry of history, historians, and editors who make their daily living from it. In 1975, Georg Lieber gave the Air Force's School for Non-Commissioned Officers in Appen the name Marseille Barracks. And 36 years after the Non-Commissioned Officers School's naming, the Air Force justifies the removal of the name Marseille from the barracks entrance in its official statement as follows. An evaluation based only on military achievements, however, is no longer appropriate, given today's standards. Marseille, as a fighter pilot of the Second World War, was involved in a war of aggression and annihilation, a crime caused by National Socialist Germany. According to today's understanding of tradition, this means he is no longer suitable as the namesake for a Bundeswehr barracks. Well, whoever is responsible for such a text is strongly advised to take a look at the biographies of the high-ranking Wehrmacht officers of the military resistance who have been honored by the Bundeswehr since its inception. What these gentlemen initially did to prepare for the war, and then during the war itself, presumably to contribute their part to the final victory. Probably the Marseille text from 2011 gave the agile Air Force officers' careers a significant boost, but taking out one's frustrations on a fallen 22-year-old Air Force captain was and remains absolutely disgraceful. Either way, on the 24th of November, 2021, the barracks were renamed Jürgen Schumann Barracks, in memory of the Lufthansa captain who was murdered by terrorists. One can later read in an official statement from the Non-Commissioned Officers School. Of course, Marseille is not considered a persona non grata and will remain connected to the history of the site. This, as in the case of Mulders, is simply due to the cowardice of the Air Force leadership, letting themselves be led around by the nose by left-leaning professors, by the Freiburg Military History Research Office, and professor politicians like Dancing Bears, and even being grateful for it. To the whole matter also fits the report by the American historian and Marseille biographer Robert Tate, who visited the museum at the Marseille Barracks in the early 1990s to photograph Marseille's awards for his book. On this occasion, he was informed that Marseille's Knight's Cross had been stolen. But who was this youthful source of controversy? Well, in order to understand the man, Hans-Joachim Marseille, called Jochen, later known as the Star of Africa, you have to delve deeply into his childhood and youth, his environment, the temptations he faced. You have to immerse yourself in the era in which he lived. Also, you have to consider the competition among the pilots. And finally, you always have to check what has been said or written about him. For example, the statement of another person. With Marseille as a lieutenant on the African Theater of War in Fighter Wing 27, flown by the German air ace Werner Schröer. He had indeed confirmed to Marseille that he was the most astonishing and brilliant fighter pilot he had ever seen. But he also put this into perspective when he added, he was also very lucky on many occasions. He didn't think twice about throwing himself into a fight of 10 against 1. Often alone, while we tried to catch up with him, he broke every basic rule of combat. In contrast, the Austrian Eduard du Neumann, who last served as a colonel in the war, was, as captain, Marseille's superior in 1941 in the first group of Fighter Wing 27 deployed in Africa. Went deeper with his assessment when, after Marseille reported to him, along with other young replacement pilots, he wrote about the in many areas militarily undisciplined Joachim Marseille. Because of his personnel papers, Marseille was perhaps observed a bit more critically than the other 9. He must have sensed this as well, because in the first days in Africa, he was often seen wandering alone and withdrawn through the desert terrain of Gazala. As he later admitted, during these walks he intensely occupied himself with the problems of fighter aviation and tactically prepared himself for his air battles. I will come back to Neumann's statement later, because it proves that you don't become a flying ace by throwing all the basic rules overboard. Hans-Joachim Marseille was born on December 13th, 1919, at 164 Berliner Strasse in Charlottenburg, which became a district of Greater Berlin since 1920. His father was the police officer and, after transferring to the Wehrmacht in 1935, the later Major General Siegfried Marseille. He had divorced his wife Charlotte. Here you can see First Lieutenant Joachim Marseille with his mother, when he and his 2-year-older sister Ingeborg were still little children. Hans Joachim almost died of the Spanish flu. While the sister apparently had a good relationship with their father later on, Joachim's relationship with him was considered tense. On January 29, 1944, Major General Marseille, as commander of the Garrison Command, 324, was killed in a partisan attack in Kursk, in Ukrainian Novoselsky, 45 kilometers north of Petrikov. He rests with another 20,412 German soldiers at the war cemetery in Berjosa in Belarus. After the divorce, the children stayed with their mother, who, among other things, gave her son the opportunity to take riding lessons as well as a classical piano education. Later, Hans-Joachim Marseille had a large record collection that included American jazz. When he became a fighter pilot in North Africa, there was only one favorite song for him by the Cuban group La Cuona Cuban Boys, which was played in his tent almost around the clock. The title, Rumba Azul. This song was played for him one last time at his funeral. Hans-Joachim Marseille had already stood out at school as a real Berlin rascal, but when something interested him, he pursued it with dedication. After graduating from the Prince Heinrich Gymnasium in Berlin-Schöneberg, he completed the mandatory 6 months of Reich labor service required of every German from March to August 1938. Then, in October, he voluntarily joined the Air Force as an officer cadet, where he first received basic infantry training in the Flieger Replacement Unit 17 at the Quedlinburg Air Base. When he expressed his interest in pilot training to his father, who was now serving as a colonel in charge of the Bremen II Military District Command, his father paved the way for him. Then, first starting on March 1st, 1939 at the Air War School, established in Fürstenfeldbruck, Joachim Marseille received his first flight training, but even there he stood out due to a number of disciplinary offenses. The young Berliner, like generations before him, kept getting drunk again and again. However, this was often right before the training flights. Normally, such behavior in peacetime would have resulted in immediate removal from pilot training. But first, it was already wartime. And second, even in Germany, good young pilots didn't grow on trees. Therefore, along with other candidates from Fürstenfeldbruck, he came to fighter pilot school in Schwechat for further training, where he received additional instruction, besides others, from the prominent Austrian captain Julius Arrighi, who was Austria's number 2 in World War I with 32 aerial victories and, among other things, was the most highly decorated non-commissioned officer of the Old Common Army, having been awarded the Golden Medal for bravery 4 times. But even Arrighi could not avoid repeatedly reprimanding Marseille. Yet at the same time, he also recognized his exceptional flying talent. On March 13, 1939, Joachim Marseille became an officer cadet and was promoted to cadet corporal on May 1, on July 1st as a cadet sergeant, and on November 1st, 1939 as an ensign. On February 1st, 1940, Marseille was awarded the pilot's badge. Then, on the 18th of July, he completed fighter pilot school for Spavai with excellent marks. Initially, he was assigned to the supplementary fighter unit Mersburg, which had been stationed at the Mersburg West Airfield since February 1940, and was tasked with defending the Leuna works until November 1940. There, synthetic gasoline was produced. Then, on August 10, 1940, Officer Cadet Marseille was transferred to Fighter Wing 2 on the Channel Coast. Starting from August 22nd, he served in the 1st Fighter Group, and he took part in the Battle of Britain from Calais. On his first mission on the 24th of August, he achieved his first aerial victory over a Hurricane Mark I over Kent. But after praise from the Führer of the 1st Group, Oberleutnant Herbert Ehlefeld, he was also reprimanded for having abandoned his wingman during the air battles, which, according to Ehlefeld, would make him a poor team player. But already on the next mission on the 9th of September, Marseille achieved his 2nd downing, for which he was awarded the Iron Cross 2nd Class. On September 17th, after his 5th aerial victory, he received the Iron Cross 1st Class. Over the next few months, many more medals and awards would follow. On the 3rd of October, 1941, he received the Honor Goblet for Special Achievement in the Air War, and shortly after that, the Army Honor Dagger. On the 24th of November, 1941, he received the German Cross in Gold. On February 22nd, 1942, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. On June 6, 1942, the Oak Leaves. On June 18th, the Swords. And on September 2nd, 1942, as the 4th award ever, the Diamonds. In August 1942, he received the Pilot and Observer Badge in Gold with diamonds, and then the Italian Pilot Badge. On the 18th of August 1942, as only one of 2 German soldiers, the Italian Gold Medal for bravery. This was followed by the Front Flight Clasp for fighters in gold with pendant insert number 300. On June 7, 1943, the Africa Cup title. Finally, 6 mentions in the High Command of the Wehrmacht's report, such as the one from Thursday, June 18, 1942. Oberleutnant Marseille shot down 10 enemy aircraft in North Africa within 24 hours, bringing his total number of aerial victories to 101. And on November 30, 1962, the Italian Minister of Defense, Giulio Andreotti, ordered that, to the families of the only 2 German recipients of the rare Italian Gold Medal for Valor, Hans-Joachim Marseille, who fell on September 30, 1942, and the German pilot with 135 aerial victories, who fell in Africa on March 23, 1943, Captain Joachim Müncheberg, a one-time payment of 1,500 mark was to be given. At the beginning of October 1940, after his 7th aerial victory, Officer Cadet Marseille was transferred to the 4th Squadron of the 2nd Group of Fighter Wing to 52. To this fighter wing, which was stationed at the Strait of Calais opposite Great Britain, also belonged the later recipient of the Oak Leaves. With swords to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, and with 301 aerial victories, the 2nd highest scoring fighter pilot in history, Lieutenant Gerhard Barkhorn, who came from Königsberg in East Prussia, here as a major. In the Bundeswehr, he later became a major general. Barkhorn's brother Helmut, as a young ensign sergeant, was killed in the first days of the Battle of France. His younger brother Dieter fell in 1943 as a lieutenant and pilot on the Western Front, and his father fought as a Volkssturm soldier during the Battle of Königsberg. The fourth group was led by Oberleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, who was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords during the war, and later became inspector of the Bundeswehr Air Force. Here with his wife and wearing his large decorations at a reception in Paris. But just after Marseille had reported to Steinhoff in October of 1940, there was friction between these two completely different characters in no time. Once again, it was due to Jochem's lack of discipline. For example, he had once borrowed Steinhoff's Kübelwagen, only to return to the quarters hours later, with a heavy tilt and accompanied by two partially unclothed ladies. In general, women played a big role in the life of the young Berliner. He is said to have developed a taste for it because of his father, who didn't like that his son was only in the company of his mother and older sister. After that, he went out on the town one night with Joachim, then stopped at a nightclub, where he introduced him to some ladies. You can imagine the rest. If you believe the reports and hints, then Joachim Marseille, among others, had an affair with Leni Riefenstahl, the wife of a German general, the Italian singer Nilla Pizzi, a Hungarian countess, and the Swedish-German actress Sarah Leander, and so on, and so on. The fact is that the initially unknown but abundantly testosterone-blessed young pilot chased after every female being so that if I didn't get up a tree by the count of 3, I couldn't escape fast enough. Back then, his main targets were especially the celebrities of the time. But as Joachim became more and more prominent over time, and was also discovered by propaganda as a military poster boy, everything started going smoothly for the strikingly handsome Knight's Cross recipient from then on. Because from now on, women were vying for a date with him, which he, who could blame him, took full advantage of. But during his time in the fourth group, he must have overdone it so much that Steinhoff, on the 24th of December, 1940, had him transferred to Fighter Wing 27. Later, even the somewhat controversial Steinhoff described the young Berlin playboy. Marseille was extremely good-looking, he was a very talented pilot, but he was unreliable. He had girlfriends everywhere, and they kept him so busy that sometimes he had to be grounded out of exhaustion. His sometimes irresponsible way of fulfilling his duties was the main reason why I had to have him transferred. But he had an irresistible charm. When Marseille reported to the first group of Fighter Wing 27, led by Captain Edward Edu Neumann at the beginning of January 1941, he already had a not very favorable reputation. The first group had been relocated to Doberitz for 3 months, from November until February 1941, for recuperation after the costly air battle over England, about 25 kilometers west of Berlin. There, Marseille immediately continued in his usual lively manner. Once, when he had a full bladder while in the air, he simply landed on the Reichsautobahn between Magdeburg and Braunschweig to take a pee. Once again, Edward Neumann. His hair was too long, and he had an arm-length list of disciplinary punishments. Of the 7 downings he reported during battles along the English Channel, 4 were not confirmed, a percentage that was too high. He was also a true Berliner. In his attempts to show off, he didn't hesitate to talk about the many girls he had slept with, including a famous actress. He was impetuous, temperamental, and rebellious. 30 years later, people would have called him a playboy. But despite all the criticism, Neumann, whose command post was a former circus wagon and was called Neumann's Colorful Stage, was also quick. In February 1941, Fighter Wing 27 moved from Dobritz to North Africa. Marcel was promoted to senior officer cadet on March 1st, and on April 1st, with effect from June 16th promoted to lieutenant. In Fighter Wing 27, he always flew a yellow ME-109 with the number 14. I already mentioned that Marseille's superior in Africa, Edward Neumann, had found him withdrawn in the first days. Of course, this was also because, after looking at the personnel papers, he probably gave the newly assigned pilot a preemptive scolding as a greeting, and Marseille's fellow pilot Schreuer later described his first days like this. He brought a very bad military reputation with him and was unpleasant. He liked to show off and thought his movie star connections were very important. But that was only one side of the outwardly so cool Marseille, here with a British helmet and mandolin, because in reality he was insecure and vulnerable due to his early life experiences. To make matters worse, his African fighter pilot career had also started with a failure. On his first mission, he was shot down and had to make a forced landing in the desert. But perhaps it was precisely this experience that was crucial for his later victories. Because he had probably realized that he had to fight an air battle not just daringly, but with careful thought and his own special tactics. After he internalized this, his meteoric rise began. In a very short time, he became not only the most successful fighter pilot on the African front, but the most successful German fighter pilot overall. But aside from his almost supernatural gifts in aerial combat, Marseille also had the energy to constantly study the philosophy of air combat and to always explore new tactical possibilities. Anyone who wants to learn more about his individual victories, he shot down a total of 158 Allied aircraft in his 388 combat missions, can find exhaustive information about this on the internet. However, it is less well known what kind of fascination he exerted on his fellow pilots during his aerial battles. There are reports from other successful fighter pilots who flew with him, but briefly interrupted their own dogfights to watch, spellbound, as Marseille shot down enemy planes in rapid succession. Thus, on September 1st, 1942, he shot down a total of 17 enemy aircraft during his 3 missions. While he was escorting Ju-87 Stukas to El Taqwa in Libya in the morning, he shot down 2 Hurricane and 3 Spitfire fighters. Then, in the late morning in the Alam Halfa area, he shot down 7 P-40 Kitty Hawks, and in the afternoon, while escorting bombers on the way to El Umayyad, he shot down another 5 Hawker Hurricanes. In the meantime, he had transformed from an undisciplined egotist into a good leader of the 3rd Squadron, whose greatest concern was not to lose any of his pilots. In fact, his squadron had suffered very few losses, and he was still always good for a prank. Werner Schreuer, with 61 confirmed aerial victories and, alongside Marseille, the most successful German fighter pilot on the African continent, could have told a story or two about that. One day, he came to me in his Volkswagen Jeep, which was painted with desert rats, to visit my 8th Squadron. He had named it Otto, after the Italian word Otto for the number 8. And it was meant to remind everyone of his shooting down 8 Allied aircraft in a single day. Then, after a chat, a cup of sweet coffee, and a glass of Italian doppio Kümmel, he got back into his Kubelwagen, drove it straight toward my tent, flattened everything to the ground, and then drove off grinning. But those were just harmless pranks among the modern gladiators of the Second World War, for whom the saying also applied, who supposedly spoke to their Roman predecessors when entering the arena, addressing the ruler. Ave, Caesar, moriturite salutent. Hail to you, Caesar. Those who are about to die salute you. Because by then, the big boy from Berlin had become a serious young man who had developed his own personal training program in Africa. At the end of it stood the fighter pilot Joachim Marseille with superior abilities. By getting his eyes used to the strong desert sun, he was able to spot enemy aircraft before his comrades, and by training his leg and abdominal muscles, he could withstand higher G-forces for longer than others. By outmaneuvering enemy aircraft extremely quickly, he often became invisible to enemy pilots and, with his close-range shooting technique, achieved an incredible record. He almost never used his gun sight and instead fired a burst at the passing target within seconds. He had calculated that when firing a short burst from this position, his bullets would hit the engine and cockpit of the target, and he had perfected this unorthodox aiming method many times on his comrades' planes as well. Of course, without firing, but he couldn't even explain how he managed to achieve these kills. On average, he only needed 15 shots to shoot down an aircraft. Lieutenant Friedrich Kerner, who flew with Marseille at the time and later became a major general in the German Air Force, described his comrade like this: "Everyone knew that no one could handle him. No one could do the same thing. Some of the pilots tried, like Stahlschmidt, me, and Gustav Rudel. Marseille was an artist. He was up there, and the rest of us were somewhere down here." Johannes Steinhoff was probably not entirely wrong when he stated that Marseille's quasi-punitive transfer had turned the good fighter pilot Hans-Joachim Marseille into an outstanding one. And Steinhoff said that it was only the lack of girls, bars, and distractions of that kind that enabled him to focus on the war. Additionally, Marseille, shown on the right with war correspondent Lieutenant Fritz Deppmann, was entirely apolitical, like the vast majority of his peers who were at the front. In February of 1942, Marseille got engaged to Hannelie Küpper, and his tent was decorated with her pictures. At the end of the year, he wanted to marry the Berlin teacher and singer who is visiting his mother here. Hannelie Küpper had been married to the Argentine music publisher Cesar Renato Baja since March 31st, 1939. However, the marriage had already been dissolved on September 12, 1940. Later, after Marseille's death on the 28th of December, 1944, she married Martin Stefani, the music consultant at the SS Main Leadership Office and, after World War II, director of the Northwest German Music Academy in Detmold. On April 1st, 1942, Hans-Joachim Marseille was promoted to Oberleutnant, effective May 8th. Here on the left with Field Marshal Rommel. On September 1st, effective the 19th, here with Field Marshal Kesselring as the youngest captain in the Luftwaffe. Then, starting from the 24th of August, 1942, he assigned a South African black corporal, Matthew P. Latulu, known as Matthias, who was taken prisoner of war in Tobruk, to be his orderly, placed under his personal protection, so to speak. Of course, this was also accepted by his squadron comrades after Marseille's death. In the few months of his active service, Marseille had almost surpassed the record of Hans Arnold Stahlschmidt, who fell on the 7th of September, 1942, near El Alamein, who had earned 59 victories in 5 weeks. But Marseille was deeply shaken both physically and mentally by the strain of the hectic pace and the constant fight against the material superiority of the Allies. At that time, the strength of the German fighter force was only 112 aircrafts, of which only 65 were operational, compared to around 800 English planes. After his last combat mission on the 26th of September, during which he achieved 7 aerial victories, he was so exhausted that his hands were shaking uncontrollably, and he was on the verge of collapse. As a result, Edward Neumann gave him a few days' ban from flying as a break to recover. But then came the 30th of September, 1942. On this Wednesday, Marseille's life had reached its fateful end. After his yellow Bf-109 G caught fire and his cockpit filled completely with smoke, Joachim Marseille bailed out at 11:45 a.m. from several hundred meters up, but was struck in the chest and hip by the tail fin and was probably fatally wounded at that moment. His parachute also failed to open, so he fell several hundred meters to the ground. The motor vehicle in the background marks the crash site of Captain Marseille. This took place about 7 kilometers from Sidi Abdel Rahman in Egypt, where in 1989, former squadron mates of Marseille, in the presence of the Egyptian government, restored the honorary pyramid built for him during the war and thought to have been lost. At first, Marseille's mortal remains were recovered by soldiers from the staff units of the Darmstadt Panzer Grenadier Regiment 115, which was stationed in this area. Then they were brought back to the field airstrip by his squadron leader, Captain Ludwig Franziskit. Then, in the presence of the High Command, specifically the Luftwaffe in Africa, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, front left, he was buried at the German military cemetery in Derna, Libya, as part of a ceremony attended by the squadron and also many Italian Air Force comrades. After the war, Joachim Marseille was transferred to Tobruk, to the Afrika Korps Memorial there, and was buried there. In the family grave in Berlin-Schöneberg, this plaque commemorates him. After his death, especially his comrades from the 1st Squadron were so shocked that they did not participate in any combat missions for almost a month. After Hans Arnold Stahlschmidt, this was already the second heavy loss that had unsettled the battle-hardened soldiers. If you look at Marseille's short life as a successful fighter pilot, the question arises whether such a warlike personality as his would have survived the war. At some point, the Chainsmoker's constitution probably wouldn't have held up anymore, which had already become apparent after the last missions with his uncontrollable trembling. In addition to his brilliant talent to be able to shoot successfully from the most impossible angles, he was also in the end simply too impetuous and too impatient. Maybe he was also driven by a longing for death, like you often see in extreme athletes. Surely a good psychotherapist could find an explanation for some of his behaviors. That could also be connected to the mysterious death of his closely bonded older sister on January 2nd, 1942. Her death certificate states that she was found dead in her apartment in Berlin and the cause of death was unknown. The death certificate information may have been fabricated since Ingeborg was with a foreign officer at the time of her death, and her husband's noble family might have wanted to prevent a scandal. When Hans-Joachim Marseille learned about the circumstances of his sister, whom he had always seen as a paragon of virtue, he was reportedly visibly depressed and dejected. If you compare Joachim Marseille with Erich Hartmann, who was also awarded the Diamonds and is the most successful fighter pilot in the history of aerial warfare, with 352 confirmed downings, he would always first assess the situation, and if it seemed promising, then he would launch his attack. But if you look at the fate of many other top pilots of the German Luftwaffe who fell during the course of the war, Marseille would likely have suffered a similar fate if he had had to face the overwhelming superiority of the Allied air forces from 1943 onward. By the end, the ratio was 20-1. And if he had survived, like Hartmann, who joined the new Air Force as a major in 1956 after 10 years in Soviet captivity, he probably would have fared similarly in the peacetime Bundeswehr as the hothead Hartmann, who was treated so badly for so long that he eventually resigned on his own on the 30th of September, 1970. But while all those responsible at the time in the Federal Ministry of Defense disappeared into obscurity after their retirement, there is a bestseller about Booby Hartmann titled Holt Hartmann vom Himmel. And in 1957, the box office hit German feature film Der Stern von Afrika about Joachim Marseille was released in theaters. It was so successful precisely because the critics, who just a few years earlier had loudly shouted out the Nazi propaganda, now loudly trashed it. But, as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once said in a poem about the work of critics, "The thousand cursed man, beat him dead, the dog, it's a reviewer."